Romana, would you like to do an introduction?
Yes, sir. So today we have a research presentation by Anushka, Goyal, and Shefali on personalization of grief. Over to you, team.
Thank you, Dr. Ramana. Good morning, everyone. So, as Dr. Ramana mentioned, we have a presentation on personalization of grief, notes on vicarious trauma. Anushka Goyal and I will be presenting this presentation to you today. So, firstly, to go over the contents, we will be looking into what vicarious trauma actually means and who can be impacted by it. Then, we'll talk about what personalization of grief means and what are the factors increasing the risk of vicarious trauma. We can also look into if the impact of vicarious trauma and also on therapists and first responders. We'll then talk about some protective factors and the role of resilience, as well as some case studies. Now, to go into what is vicarious trauma, the concept of vicarious trauma firstly was introduced by McCann and Perlman in 1990, and after that, it gained a lot of interest among researchers. So, for example, you can see that Figley in 1995 used terms like secondary traumatic stress to talk about all of those individuals who, because of some repeated and close relationships with other individuals who have directly experienced traumatic events, are at a risk of becoming indirect victims of that same trauma. So everyone is potentially exposed to at least one traumatic event during their lifetime. So especially for people in helping professions, the likelihood increases because they themselves are exposed to a lot more stressful events. So it can be said that this risk it affects pretty much all of the professions that provide assistance and support to individuals or populations basically who are victims of trauma. So since then, since 1990, a lot of different theoretical concepts have emerged to talk about this phenomenon. One of those is secondary traumatic stress, as Sigley had mentioned, and he defined it as the natural consequent behaviors and emotions resulting from knowledge about a traumatic event. Um, a lot of the symptoms of this secondary traumatic stress, it mimics those symptoms that are seen in individuals who are directly exposed to trauma. So things like intrusive imagery, avoidant responses, physiological arousal, insomnia, and chronic irritability. Now, compassion fatigue is a development of Figley's original construct of secondary traumatic stress. It is characterized by reduced capacity of or interest in being empathic or bearing the suffering of clients. So, similar to secondary traumatic stress, the symptoms of compassion fatigue are very similar to those of post traumatic stress disorder. Now, even though these two constructs focus on the symptoms that one can see on the outside, vicarious trauma actually centers around the changes to cognitive schema and core beliefs of the person. This is because there's an exposure to the traumatic material presented by clients or even other people. So it is associated more with cognitive disruptions of in areas of trust, safety, dependency, power, self-esteem, and intimacy. Now, looking into who can be impacted by vicarious trauma, as I have mentioned before, it can affect a wide range of people who are indirectly exposed to trauma through different types of means. So the first one would be professionals in helping professions. So healthcare workers, social workers, therapists, counselors, and first responders, because they work very closely with trauma survivors or victims of violence. Then journalists and media personnel. So because journalists, reporters, photographers, editors, they cover dramatic events such as maybe natural disasters, terrorist attacks, or even criminal cases, they experience vicarious trauma because they are repeatedly exposed to maybe graphic images or distressing stories and traumatic footage. Then family members and friends of trauma survivors. Um, so these people may experience vicarious trauma because they witness the emotional impact and the struggle of their loved ones. So this can occur in cases of domestic violence, sexual assault, or childhood abuse. Community members and witnesses. Because people who witness or hear about traumatic events in their communities, they can be included in the situation or the event as bystanders to some accidents, neighbors to crime scenes, or even residents of areas that are affected by disasters like earthquakes or floods. Then we have supporters and advocates. So these are all advocates, activists, or volunteers that are working for the cause related to trauma. So, for example, it could be survival of sexual violence, human right abuses, or environmental disasters. So, because they empathize with the stories and struggles of the people that they support, they might experience vicarious trauma. Students and researchers who are also studying trauma related topics can be exposed to a lot of graphic content, case studies, or detailed interviews with the trauma survivors. This can also trigger vicarious trauma if it is not very adequately managed or even processed. Then, caregivers, foster parents, or even guardians who provide care and support to the children or even adults who have experienced trauma can experience vicarious trauma as they witness the emotional pain and challenges faced by those who are in their care. Then, military personnel and veterans who have been exposed to combat or other traumatic experiences during the service can experience vicarious trauma when they are hearing about or witnessing the trauma of their fellow service members. Then teachers and school counselors. So school counselors or teachers or even other staff members actually can experience vicarious trauma when they are working with students who have experienced a lot of traumatic bullying, abuse, neglect, or violence in the school or even at home, as they empathize with the students' challenges. And lastly, we have the general public. So, the members of the general public who consume media coverage of traumatic events may be following stories of their public figures, they engage with these social issues that are related to trauma. Right? So, taking this point forward of how the general public is affected by vicarious trauma, we can look into what personalization of grief means. Right. So personalization of grief basically is a phenomenon where people develop a very deep emotional and usually a very intense connection to the grief that is experienced by others. This is most likely in public figures and celebrities, as if the person's loss was their own personal loss. So, this is actually a lot more related to how parasocial relationships are formed, right? Since a normal individual is very highly connected, emotionally connected with their celebrity or a public figure, this is a parasocial relationship, right? Now, when their public figure or their celebrity goes through any sort of struggle, challenge, or traumatic event, it can sort of reflect on the individual themselves since they have that connection with that emotional connection with their public figure. So, an example of this can be the passing of Princess Diana in 1997, or also the famous actor Heath Ledger in 2008. Um, there will be a lot more case studies at the end of this presentation as well. Now, the reason why these events became, very widespread, there was a lot of public mourning. There was a lot of expression of grief between the people. It was mainly because the people had expressed how deeply they felt connected with these public figures, with these celebrities. So they felt a deep sense of loss and a loss of emotional connection with the person, despite never actually knowing them publicly, personally, right? Now, further, Anushka is going to talk about the factors which increase the risk of experiencing vicarious trauma. Over to you, Anushka.
Thank you, Shefali. So, since now we have understood about vicarious trauma and personalization of grief, let's look at some of the factors which increase our risk of experiencing vicarious trauma. Post traumatic experiences make us more vulnerable to experiencing vicarious trauma because when we are exposed to any similar type of trauma in our life, it further increases our sensitivity to that trauma and the related material, further increasing the risk of experiencing secondary trauma stress reactions. Um, Then further, socially being socially isolated and not having any social support network can also limit our access to coping resources, making us more sensitive to the experience of trauma, to the feelings and thoughts that are the outcome of it, which further limits our opportunities to engage in self-care practices and impairing our capabilities to be resilient and to cope with the traumatic experience or vicarious trauma in a healthy manner. Our first response, mostly in any unpleasant situation, is basically to avoid thinking about it and not giving attention to it, which does give us the short term relief temporarily, which is temporary in nature, but in the long run, the same repressed material can get reflected in different aspects of our life, like strained relationships with others, feeling burnout, lack of motivation, poor relationship with our own self, affecting our cognitive abilities as well. Expressing our feelings in any form or medium often gives us a better way to deal with those feelings, because when we are expressing, we become more aware not only of our feelings but also of our thoughts, and further this helps us develop a clear stance of the entire situation. However, difficulty in expressing our feelings and thoughts and not being able to express them can directly block our ability to deal with the difficult situations, which can further worsen the impact of vicarious trauma that we experience. If we are constantly being exposed to intense forms of trauma, then it further restricts our ability to cope with it. Shifali, can we go on to the next slide? Okay, so now let's look at how vicarious trauma impacts an individual. So, vicarious trauma not only affects our affect, but it also affects other aspects of our life. It may lead an individual to experience cognitive difficulties, like difficulties with problem solving, decision making, analytical, practical thinking, attention, concentration. Emotional distress may also be experienced in the form of intense fear, anger, helplessness, and heightened stress. It can also make it difficult for an individual to maintain their professional boundaries, their ability to make sound judgments, or providing effective care to their to other individuals, be it their family member who is experiencing any sort of trauma, or in terms of their professional career, experiencing a sense of burnout, job dissatisfaction, and diminished performance. Some of the psychological symptoms, like intrusive thoughts, nightmares, avoidance behaviors related to the traumatic experience, hypervigilance, and anxiety, may also be experienced. Now, exposure to suffering of others can prompt questions about the nature of suffering, one's meaning in life, and questions about their own morality, which may contribute to what is known as existential crisis. A combination of physical difficulties can also be experienced, like headache, migraine, gastrointestinal difficulties, and poor immune functioning. There can also be alterations in how we perceive oneself and also the external world, along with strained relationships with our friends, colleagues, and family members. It can also make us at risk of developing what is known as secondary traumatic stress disorder, which is generally characterized by the symptoms which are similar to that of post traumatic stress disorder. Shafali, can we go on to the next slide? Okay. Now, research studies have shown that therapists and first responders are generally among one of the majority of the population who experience vicarious trauma. Now, who are these first responders? So, first responder is any person who is among the first to arrive at the scene or the place of an emergency or disaster or any trauma. Therapist. Uh, and both first responders can experience vicarious trauma, which can lead them to experience emotional exhaustion, which can come up in terms of feeling drained or overwhelmed, not being able to allowing themselves to experience certain emotions, or being always overcharged with emotions. Experiencing secondary traumatic stress can also secondary traumatic stress can also be experienced by them, which includes experience of intrusive thoughts, nightmares, hypervigilance, avoidance behaviors, feelings of emotional, physical, social burnout, and also compassion fatigue. Now, all of these things further contribute to a poor work performance, questioning the nature of suffering and resilience, having difficulties with in terms of their physical and psychological health, having some cognitive impairments like diffused ability to think clearly or make proper decisions, and strained relationships in terms of their professional career, with their family, with their friends, and with their colleagues as well. Moving on, um, now let's look at the role of protective factors and resilience, and how can these contribute to the experience of vicarious trauma. So when we talk about protective factors, we can see, Shefali, next slide, please. Okay, so we can see that there are some of the things, some of the factors that play a crucial role in helping us deal better in a healthy way with the experience of vicarious trauma. First and foremost, being social support. When we have a healthy social support network around us, it gets better for us to deal with that vicarious trauma, because we have people around us with whom we can feel safe. We can express our vulnerabilities, our fears, our thoughts, who can better help us take care of mental and physical health. Practicing in self-care. Self-care is something that I think all therapists or all first care responders or anyone who is in the helping profession should engage in, because it not only helps them establish a better relationship with their own self, but also allows them to foster better nurturing and caring environment to those around themselves. Now, boundaries and work life balance is again something which is extremely helpful when it comes to professions like being a therapist or being a first care responder, because when we are able to establish those boundaries, it gets easier for an individual to separate their work and their personal life, which further restricts the impact that maybe their emotions while working as a therapist or as a first care responder does not get carried away to their own personal life. Then supervision and peer support is again something which is very helpful, because whenever an individual, a professional, is going through experiences of burnout or vicarious trauma, and experiencing compassion fatigue as a result of it, supervision and support of their peers is something which can guide them, with the help of having a mentor who is there to give them feedbacks and some suggestions on how they can take care of their own mental health in a better way while dealing with other individuals. Having a meaning and sense of purpose in the kind of work they are doing, why it is important for them, knowing all of those reasons, having a better understanding of their purpose of being in that kind of profession, and also having a sense of meaning and purpose for their own personal life is again something which uh, helps in a great way. Having the ability to be flexible and to adapt to the changing situations and the circumstances, all of these things combined can again lead to effective coping whenever we or any other individual as a professional in the helping field can use and develop in their day-to-day habits to cope better with the traumatic experiences that they have in their professions. Going on to the next slide. So now we have some case studies. So the first one is the very famously known Nirbhaya case, which happened in 2012. Um, the Delhi gang rape case, wherein the and this is again something which led a lot of people, a lot of families, a lot of young growing women. This case led them to experience a lot of emotions like sorrow, anger, sadness. There was fear, there was feeling of helplessness, and a constant fear of something similar happening to them. And also including how all of most of the population, majority of the population, was able to empathize with the entire situation, and as a result of which the response was a lot of protests happening, which were demanding justice and improving the safety protocols for women in public areas and elsewhere, and a lot of social media activism. So this event particularly was something that involved a lot of outrage from the public population, considering the safety of other women. Okay, over to you, Shefali. Okay, I think Shefali is facing some network issues. I'll go ahead. So then,
I'm so sorry. I was speaking on mute. Apologies.
okay.
Right. So the next case that we will be talking about is the death of Sushant Singh Rajput in 2020. So as we all know, after the passing of Sushant Singh Rajput in 2020, a lot of the social media platforms, news channels, they explicitly covered his death. There were a lot of news articles. There were a lot of also conspiracy theories and people's personal opinions at a very very fast pace. Now, there was also a lot of misinformation online, on news channels, on social media platforms, and there was also very specific harassment targeted at people who were associated with the case, right? So they were also going through a lot of distress along with the public. So a lot of the members of the general public, they experienced a lot of emotional distress and grief. So this was the impact on the people, the fans of the actor, and also other individuals who just empathize with his struggles. They felt a very deep sense of loss, sadness. They found it very difficult to process their emotions, even since there was a lot of intense media scrutiny. The media coverage, of course, it sensationalized the entire news, and that also led to a lot of feelings of anxiety and uncertainty among the public, because there was a constant barrage of like news updates, rumors, conspiracy theories, and all of that created this climate of fear and mistrust in the entertainment industry itself. Now, the response to this entire event was that fans would organize candlelight vigils, they had tribute events, there were also online memorials at that time to just honor his memory and express their love for him. The public also included a lot of calls for justice and accountability within the entertainment industry and just the society at large, right? They also demanded a lot more transparent investigation into the circumstances surrounding his passing, and they advocated for reforms to address all of these issues related to mental health and the stigma that we face when we talk about mental health. There was a lot of talk, a lot of conversation around nepotism in Bollywood as well. Right. So this death prompted a lot of introspection and dialogue on things like mental health awareness, professional pressure in the entertainment industry, how we require empathy and compassion even when we are publicly talking about somebody's passing. Right. So These were just some of the things that the public altogether had went through in something very similar to vicarious trauma. Now, moving on to the Q&A section, we have a few questions for everyone. It would be great if you could drop the answers in the chat box. So, firstly, who can be affected by vicarious trauma? A. People working or volunteering in the fields of victim services. B. Individuals who work as advocates, activists, or volunteers for causes related to trauma. C. Members of the general public who consume media coverage of traumatic events, follow stories of public figures, or engage with social issues related to trauma. D. All of the above.
The answers received from the participants are D.
Yes, correct. The answer is D. All of the people who have been mentioned in the options above can be affected by vicarious trauma. Thank you, everyone. The next question is, who can be at a greater risk of experiencing vicarious trauma? People with social support. B. People who express their worries and anxieties openly. C. People with prior traumatic experiences. Or D. None of the above. Right. I see most of the answers as C. People with prior traumatic experiences. That is correct. Next question is, how can one build resilience against vicarious trauma? A. Building strong social support. B. Creating a meaning and purpose in life. C. Establishing healthy work life boundaries. And D. All of the above. Yes, the answer is D. All of the above. Thank you everyone for participating. Thank you for also staying patient.